Welcome in. It is week 8. It is the Football Guys DFS show. And to be honest with you, my mind is pretty blown because after weeks of London games, multiple Monday night games, bye weeks, we have 13 games on the main slate this week. But we're going to walk through DraftKings primarily, FanDuel a little bit as well, and hit your cash game lineups and hit your GPP lineups, our favorite plays of the week, our stacks, and our discount plays. But first off, we have our fearless leader, Devin Knotts, our Dynasty or DFS captain, is back from his suspension. So, Devin, great to see you.
Yeah, my 6-day suspension for a weekly show. I'm glad to be back. It was a really difficult serving that 6-day suspension, but here we are.
And then, of course,
had to do it for the team, Jeff. Had to do it for the team.
Yeah. Do it for the team. Of course, we have our Phil Alexander's back too. So the gang is all here, and we're going to dive through this big slate. But Phil, why don't you start us off and kind of what games are you targeting on this slate?
Well, we can't risk another suspension to Devin, so we'll do it a little bit differently this week. So he lays off of me. So yeah, I'll get into the games, but real quick, you mentioned that it's a 13 game slate. That adds a lot of variability to what we could do in our lineups. And not only that, this is an especially fun week because injuries kind of already flipped the slate on its head, and it's only Wednesday because a lot of those injuries happened on Monday after the pricing for this week had already been released. So we've got a lot of value already. We should see a lot of diversity, even in cash games, and there's lots of different ways to build. So I'm sure as we go through each position, we're gonna talk about that. But I'm gonna give you one game I'm targeting. How about that? My favorite game on the slate is Packers
Cleveland versus Baltimore.
I mean, the Baltimore side of that one looks okay. Packers at Jaguars is the one that I'm looking at. It happens to have the highest over-under at 49.5. I just see things playing out where the Packers get out to a lead. The Jaguars are chasing the entire time. Lots of big downfield plays on both sides as they kind of degaff the ball all over the place. So that's the one that I'm targeting, and I'll be nice and I'll let you guys take turns this week. What other games do you guys like?
Devin, do you have any other ones that you're looking at?
Yeah, I joked, but we'll talk about this Cleveland-Baltimore game. I do think that there's going to be points scored. Baltimore can't stop the pass. They're allowing over 300 yards passing per game, and Cleveland is kind of in a DGAF mode as far as their season. So certainly one that I'm targeting. I think the Bears-Washington game is certainly interesting. I know that sounds like Jaden Daniels is not going to play, but that's fine. I do like the Bears side of it. And then Philly-Cincinnati has a potential shootout as well. So there's a couple games that I am targeting this week. And then Miami-Arizona just because it's two really bad defenses.
Well, and if we get the return of Tua Tagovailoa this week, that changes a lot, I think, in the complexion of that game and also probably, honestly, the complexion of the slate, too. I think the other one that Phil mentioned the injuries, and obviously you're talking about Tampa Bay with those injuries, but Tampa Bay going up against Atlanta a couple weeks after giving up 500-plus passing yards to Atlanta. That's another one that I don't know if Tampa's going to have the offense maybe to push Atlanta the way that they did in that previous matchup to force their hand in throwing the ball that way. But, I mean, you see Kirk Cousins come off a game with 500 passing yards, and the next time that team is on the slate, I mean, that's going to raise eyebrows for me as well. But Phil, you led into it, and Devin, why don't you dive in maybe a little bit on how to handle a slate like this with all these shifts in the injuries and so many different games in play?
Yeah, I mean, I don't view it really any differently. Like wide receivers, I want targets. Running backs, I want touches. And like for cash, that's sort of how I approach it every single week. I want, certainly you can take more risk this week, so you can take chances on some of those cheap wide receivers or cheap running backs that might be out there. But like, I'm not viewing it any different. I think some people try to get way too cute on these types of slates and overthink it. If you want to take one or two guys that are in, value plays that are going to see an increased role, I think that's fine. But don't go with like a complete stars and scrubs lineup just because there's like 4 value guys, because not all of them are going to hit.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to look at it and to play it. And before we continue on into our cash game lineups, please take a minute to like and subscribe the video. We don't have a giveaway this week. Maybe next week we'll get back into giving the giveaways, but we do appreciate your support, and those likes and the subscriptions to the channel go a long way towards making this great content. But now we're going to dive into the cash games, and we're going to start with our quarterbacks and our cash quarterbacks. And Devin, how are you building out your cash quarterback lineup?
Yeah, I mean, I think for cash, it's pretty simple this week. It's Tua Tagovailoa at 6,100. Just seems underpriced at home against Arizona. This is an offense that really hasn't been performing, but I think it's a cheap enough price, and there's enough out there this week that getting a player like Tua. And certainly we're going to talk about receiver, but Tyreek Hill is going to be in my lineup this week, and I think he's going to be pretty popular. But so getting that stack, I think it's going to be a slate where, certainly you could look to spend up. It's always an option, but I'm looking to really try to spend elsewhere this week rather than the quarterback position. So I was actually looking, and we'll talk about GPPs, but I think Jameis Winston is in a really good spot this week. And if you really wanted to spend down, he would be my spend down target. But I think that for this week, it's Tua for me.
Phil, how are you on Tua as well? Or are you looking at a different cash game play?
I think every Dolphins player, or at least the ones that matter for our purposes, are about $1,000 underpriced. I think you could say that about Tua. You could say that about HN. You could say that about Tyreek Hill. And you could say that about Jalen Waddle. Whether or not I'm playing him in cash, I haven't decided. I don't know how much of a help I'm going to be to the folks out there because I'm still working through this. The sense that I'm getting, like from what I'm reading across the industry and on my timeline, is that Bo Nix is going to be a popular cash game play at 5,600. I get it insofar as he projects as probably the top point per dollar play. He has a terrific matchup. Denver even has an implied team total at 26 points, which is somewhat shocking. But my concern this week specifically relates to what Devin was talking about, and that's that I think I need somewhat of a ceiling in these cash game lineups because people are going to be coming at them very differently, right? Like we might see some builds with Lamar Jackson. That wouldn't surprise me. There's enough value on the slate for it to happen. And at that point, if I'm playing Bo Nix, and yeah, is he a good bet to score 15 points? Absolutely. Is he a great bet?
Can we talk about Bo Nix real quick? Like, yeah, I don't get it. I know he's popping in early models, but like, if I just look at Carolina's pass defense, right? 200 yards to Derek Carr. Yeah, they allowed 3 touchdowns there. 130 to Justin Herbert. 214 to Gardner Minshew. 232 to Joe Burrow. They allowed over 300 yards for one time this season against Caleb Williams. And then Kirk Cousins had 225 and 1. They're only allowing 228 passing yards per game. Now, they are allowing 2 touchdowns per game, but Bo Nix has 5 touchdowns on the season. Like, to your point, I don't see, even if he throws, I don't know, let's just say 210 yards, 220 yards. I don't see him throwing more than that. Is he going to throw for 2 touchdowns? Okay, maybe. But, that's 15 to 17 points. I guess that's good enough. But, like, to your point, I don't know, the upside with a player like a Jackson or Tua or these other players, to your point, Bo Nix to me is one of those people that people like to target Carolina's defense, but I'd much rather target the run side of that than the pass side of it.
Yeah, you went there, and I was thinking of going there too. Javonte Williams at 6,000 looks interesting against Carolina. I like that attack a little bit more than maybe the Bo Nix side of it.
Yeah, not to beat it to death, but like Denver could win that game by 30 points, and Knicks might still not get there.
They could
I
also
think
just
people
win
are
it like 21-6 because Bryce Young's terrible. Like a defensive
right.
touchdown and you're kind of screwed.
Yeah, and Knicks, I think people are looking at the rushing production, right? He's got like 140 yards on the ground over his last 2 games, and he's a decent bet to snipe a goal line carry every now and then. But
Yeah.
I think that's more like all you're getting, and the passing. Like he's not going to have to throw more than 25 times in the game. So, how much is he really going to put up? The other guy that I was looking at that I think is in the same range as Tua is probably Geno Smith. He's only 300 more than Knicks, so it's not like Knicks is some screaming value either. And regardless of DK Metcalf's availability, I think we're going to see Smith throwing the ball a lot at home against the Bills. Buffalo's a 3-point favorite in that game. I don't think anyone is expecting Seattle to blow Buffalo out. So they have the highest pass rate over expectation in the entire league already. And if you look at the games in which the Seahawks have either won or lost by fewer than 10 points, Smith is between 40 and 50 pass attempts. So I think he's more likely to get you 3x than Knicks and exponentially more likely to get you 4x. Um, so I think he's still at a pretty good price. And then if you did want to go crazy and spend the 8K on Lamar Jackson, I mean, I'm not going to blame you, right? I mean, he's pretty much locked and loaded for 25 points in any given week with upside from there. So the 8K, it isn't really scary in any matchup.
My only concern there is upside in blowout games and whether or not he needs to run as much as he otherwise would in a normal game. So I get it. I get it. But that would be my only concern.
Yeah, I think it's Geno for me, just to put a bow on that because I threw a lot of names out there, but not feeling the Knicks chalk if that's the way the slate goes, and would definitely rather either Tua or Geno Smith.
Yeah,
If
Jordan
DK
loves
Metcalf
you.
is if DK Metcalf is out, does that change your answer on Geno Smith?
Not really, because he's still going to be passing a ton, and he's still got talented weapons to throw to. I mean, it's not like Jackson Smith and Jigba, Tyler Lockett, and Noah Fant are like schlubs. You know, it's not exactly like the Tampa Bay passing game without Evans and Godwin. I mean, he's still got some talented weapons to throw to, and I don't think that they're going to change up the game plan. You could do it like we said to do it last week and throw Kenneth Walker into that stack because he's catching a lot of passes. There's a lot of different. Well, I'm sorry, we're still talking cash games, but there's a lot of ways that Geno Smith could potentially get there without DK Metcalf. That I'm not worried about it at all.
Yeah, I think for me, if I'm operating in that price range, I would rather just go with Kirk Cousins going up against the team that he threw for 500 yards on that just gave up 5 touchdown passes to Lamar Jackson. But I hear you on Geno. So let's move into running backs. And Phil, how are you looking at running backs in cash games?
Yeah, so Brees Hall might be one of the biggest lock button cash game plays for me all season. He's the first name that I looked at, and I just couldn't believe the price. Since Todd Downing took over play calling from Nathaniel Hackett, Brees Hall's seen 84% of the running back snaps, 83% of the team's carries, 67% route participation. He's first in expected points, weighted opportunity. I mean, you name it, he is the running back and has the workload that we're looking for. He's got a soft matchup this week. Over the last 5 games, New England has allowed over 50% more fantasy points to enemy running backs than the league average. 7,300 is just like a ludicrous price for someone seeing Brees Hall's workload with Brees Hall's skill set in this spot for running backs. It's running back 2 where I feel just like quarterback where I could be swayed in a bunch of different directions. I think for me right now, I would give a slight nod to Kareem Hunt at 6,300. He's not catching passes, which I don't love on DraftKings, but Dan Hendry pointed it out in one of his articles in the last couple of weeks. Even on DraftKings, like that's not really the way running backs are getting there anymore. They're seeing less and less through the air and more on the ground, but they're still separating in the way they score. And catches or no catches, Hunt is kind of the engine of that offense, unbelievably, in the year 2024. Here we are. That's what's happening. And he maintained a 65% snap rate coming off the bye. He's got 49 combined rush attempts over his last 2 games. This Raiders team is already like playing out the string. Like they look just as lost as their head coach who kicked a field goal to make it a 5-point game with less than 2 minutes to go last week. The Chiefs are deservedly double-digit favorites here, and Hunt is a solid bet, I think, for 100 yards and at least 1 rushing touchdown. So right now, I would go there, but I'm curious if maybe you guys were on some of these other guys who I also think are viable.
Devin, what are you looking at?
It seems like the whole industry has forgotten about DeAndre Swift at 6,200. Going like massively under the radar as of Wednesday, which surprises me. I mean, we've been talking about this run defense for Washington for a lot of the season. And yeah, they looked better last week, but it was certainly game script dependent. And Chuba Hubbard still ended up, with an okay day at 11.2 DraftKings points. So, I mean, this is a defense that's allowed 20 or more DraftKings points in 3 of the last 5 games, with the only 2 games being against Cleveland, which Jerome Ford and Deontay Foreman still combined for 91 yards, which is their best performance on the season. And, Hubbard and Sanders last week, I just throw it out the window because that game was never competitive. Swift in 3 games, I mean, against a good Jacksonville defense in London, ran for 91 yards and a touchdown, caught 4 passes. He had a really solid games against the Rams and Carolina before that. So this seems to be a player that they are trying to continue to use in their offense. And I just think he's underpriced at that value. Devin Achane is an interesting one because typically he's not really cash viable for me in most weeks. But, at 6,200, it's interesting because is he just kind of a, hey, lock and load it type of deal against an Arizona run defense that isn't particularly strong either? Collectively, like Tua should raise the floor of everybody in that offense. But I think where I'm struggling is the volatility and whether I need to go there compared to a player like Jahmyr Gibbs at 7,400. So I like Gibbs, especially if Montgomery is confirmed out, questionable. I don't know.
I think he'll be okay. I mean, he made it back in the game last week.
Okay. So if he's out, then I like Gibbs. If not, I like Achane. Simple enough.
So I do yellow highlights for my cash game plays, and I had Breece Hall, I had Kareem Hunt, I had DeAndre Swift, I had Devin Achane, and I had Javonte Williams, who we've already mentioned. I do have one more, Josh Jacobs at 6,600. Phil, you let off talking about that Jacksonville Green Bay game. Jacobs is a player that he got 1 rushing touchdown on the season. He's averaged just about 90 yards from scrimmage over the last 4 weeks. I think it was a little bit weird with him where he led off with that Island game and he looked pretty rusty that first half, and that set some opinions in. And then week 3, he came off that huge workload in week 2, and they really split the carries between him and Emmanuel Wilson. And I think that's kind of set some narratives in, and he's really just missing the rushing touchdowns, which I do expect the Packers to score plenty of touchdowns against the Jaguars. The Jaguars have allowed the 7th most points to the running back position in fantasy. So he is cash game viable for me, and that would be the only one that I have left there. But I think wide receivers maybe the most interesting conversation this week, given the injuries that we've seen or the return of injuries that we've seen in some areas. And Devin, how are you targeting wide receivers for your cash game?
Yeah, the big question is Tampa Bay, right? So there's essentially 3 guys, Trey Palmer, Sterling Shepard, Jalen McMillan, that are all under 4K, that are certainly in play. Phil, I don't know if you can convince me, but right now I have none of those 3 in my lineup. And maybe that's a mistake, but do you have a preference here?
Personally, I do have one of these guys in my lineup because I feel like you have to have one to make it all come together, or at least the way that I was building. Do I have a preference? Yeah, it'd be Trey Palmer, who I'm actually willing to bet is probably going to be the least likely to appear in cash game lineups out of those three. Um, but I just feel like every time that he's been given significant snaps, he'll go off for one or two big plays in those games. And I think he's got more experience with Baker Mayfield than Jalen McMillan. Sterling Shepard probably has more experience with Baker Mayfield than all of them, but he's also like late career Sterling Shepard. So I think in terms of having the most to offer, I like Palmer, and he's the cheapest and might actually make your lineup the worst unique. If you didn't want to go with a cheap Tampa receiver, by the way, you could look to Detroit, where Jamison Williams was suspended for PEDs, and now you also have a 3,500 Tim Patrick, a 3,400 Khalif Raymond. I'm not exactly sure, who's going to see the lion's share of the snap increase in Williams' absence. I think I would bet on Patrick seeing the field more than he has, and his role getting expanded, and he's looked pretty good. So there's a lot of ways that you could go at the punt wide receiver spot. Do you like the
Yeah,
Detroit guys any better?
I think I like Cedric Tillman at
Yes,
3,300.
he's another one.
12
Yeah,
target, 12 targets last week. Just seems underpriced. It's tough because those 12 targets are sort of fake, because a lot of those came with Deshaun Watson prior to his injury, or Dorian Thompson-Robinson. What's interesting is Jerry Jeudy at 4,800, and we'll get into GPPs in a second, because 5 of 11 targets from Jameis were to Jeudy. So I'm struggling between those two. I think if I was going to play a Tampa Bay guy, it would be Shepard, just because I think he's going to play more of the Godwin role. Palmer just scares me. He's on the field for 72% of the plays last week and really didn't do much. He seems more of the boomer bust type player. I would probably go Shepard if I had to pick amongst those. And then Detroit, I'm probably just avoiding because I see a consolidation there between Amon-Ra St. Brown, Sam Laporta, and Gibbs, rather than like Patrick or Khalif Raymond having like a solid role that I feel comfortable with.
Do you even need to go down there? I guess is my question, because you talk about, I think Breece Hall is probably the number one running back play at 7,300. I think it's really, really hard not to put Tyreek Hill into a lineup at 7,000. I mean, Drake London's at 7,200. So you're kind of looking at maybe the top options of the week are not the 8,000 plays that you usually see. They're more of the high sevens. And then you've got players like, Jalen Waddle at 5,400. I think Rashad Bateman is pretty attractive at 4,300. He coming off a big Monday night performance there, and you're getting Lamar Jackson instead of worrying about what it looks like with Jameson Williams there. I think there's tight end plays that are in play that can get you there too. And so I wonder, I like the Cedric Tillman call out the best out of any of those players. And you're seeing Baltimore giving up the second most fantasy points to wide receiver. You're seeing Marlon Humphrey injured. So those things are certainly in favor of Baltimore, but I'm just curious if you really need to go down there.
I would take one, I think, because I wouldn't take more than one. Because, Tyreek Hill, I think, is my favorite guy this week at 7K, and just seems underpriced, right? I mean, he should be in the 8K plus range if Tua was healthy for most of the season. So I want to play Tyreek Hill. I want to play Breece Hall. I want to play Tua. There's not really much value at running backs. You're going to spend 6K or higher at the running back position. That seems to be the new floor for DraftKings, for a running back who's going to get starting carries. So I think what you're doing is if you're going in that mid 5K range, like, do I trust the question that you have to answer to yourself is like, do I trust a Drake London Cedric Tillman combination at 10,500, or do I trust a, Tyler Lockett / Jerry Jeudy at the same price? And I'm just throwing Jeudy out there that you could fit whatever receiver you want to have in the 5 to high 4s, low 5 range for that same price. I think having that one guy, for me at least, reduces my variance because I like Drake London, because I like Tyreek Hill in what should be, we saw, to your point, Kirk Cousins go off against this Tampa Bay defense, and then Tyreek is the first name I'm clicking on. So I think it lowers your variance a little bit. I hear you. There are a number of good plays in that range, but it just makes me feel a little bit safer.
Yeah, I think sometimes what you run into when you've got ambiguity like that Tampa situation, you've got the Detroit situation open up, you saw the Tillman. I think you get some maybe less experienced DFS players that might want to grab all those pieces and say, now what fun things can I do in my lineup with the rest of it?
Derrick
So
Henry, Lamar Jackson, just have a stacked lineup, and you don't need to do that.
So you guys are going Hill, you're going London, and then one of the cheap guys.
That's how I'm building it.
Okay. Yeah, the way that I was there was one other guy I think that's a little bit less. And by the way, if DK Metcalf sits out, I think that does change the dynamic a little bit because I would heavily consider Smith and Jigba at 6,100 in that lineup and go a little bit more balanced maybe, and then maybe come down from London to like Jeff mentioned T Higgins in cash last week, and I didn't totally shrug it off, but I didn't totally buy in either. But I think I'm ready. I think Higgins against Philly. He's out targeted Jamar Chase 45 to 37 since he came back from injury. Philly isn't a scary matchup at all for opposing wide receivers. They've been okay the last couple of weeks, but it was Daniel Jones and Deshaun Watson before that. That was kind of their main weakness was against those perimeter receivers. So I think with the way Higgins is getting looks and the game environment there, which should be somewhat high scoring at the very least, I think Higgins is another guy that you could look to if you need to come down a couple hundred off of Drake London.
we've seen in the past that the Dolphins really hyper target Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle and nobody else. Is it too risky? Because Jalen Waddle sitting there at 5,400 looks pretty appetizing to me as well, along with that 7,000 price on Tyreek Hill. Is it too risky for a cash lineup to play both of them, figuring when the Dolphins are going right, you're looking at maybe 25 targets in between the two of them?
Yeah, I think it's possible. My only concern is even when Tua was like active this year, the targets really weren't there for Waddle. So that's the reason I'm not going there. 5 targets, 4 targets, 5 targets when Tua is healthy. So I'm a little concerned there, I think. But I hear you. I think that we know that target share is going to be consolidated between HN, Waddle, and Hill. And if you take 2 of those guys, you're in a pretty good spot to get a lot of that offense.
Is there anything else that you guys are seeing for cash when you move to tight ends?
I want to say Steph Diggs against Indy, but he's so expensive. I don't know. Like, usually I complain that DraftKings is too slow to raise a guy's salary. They're way too slow to lower Stephon Diggs's. He hasn't really looked like Stephon Diggs for fantasy purposes in about a year. I think he's set for a good game against Indy, but 7,500 probably takes him out of cash consideration because you've got London there and Higgins, like we said, and could save some money.
Let's hit tight end. tight end, we have the great Brock Bowers breakout, and hypothetically, he's going up against a Chiefs defense that has been gashed by tight ends. But you kind of would think that Steve Spagnuolo would not worry too much about Trey Tucker and try to be the first guy to quiet Brock Bowers. That worries me a little bit. But David Njoku potentially breaking out with Jameis Winston, or down at the bottom, you got Kate Otten at 3,500. Are those your plays for tight ends and cash, Phil, or are you looking at other directions?
Yeah, for Njoku, his price spiked by $1,000 because he was highly owned last week and also put up a good game. So I couldn't fit him in, even though it was the first name that I wanted to click on. It's very likely that Kate Otten is probably the answer to the which cheap Tampa Bay pass catcher should you be playing in cash question. He was actually fine for cash in 4 straight games before erupting in garbage time last week. He was between 7.5 and 11.2 DraftKings points prior to last week in his last 4. I just don't think that you'll find a tight end with a higher floor, period, and certainly not for 3,500. The only other one I think that makes sense with the way that I was setting out to build rosters was maybe Will Dissly at 3K. Um, Justin Herbert seemed to. I don't know how this Will Dissly continues to command targets. Like it's almost like I don't know. Like how does Kevin Costner continue to get acting jobs? Like it's like the same thing.
Hey, Draft Day was a great film.
Nothing against Draft
Kevin
Day.
Costner
Right.
gets acting jobs because he made his own movies. He cast himself.
Yeah, so I don't know. Disley was on the field a lot in the absence of Hayden Hurst last week, and he was Justin Herbert's favorite target. So
Yeah, he
he's
didn't
fine.
practice on Wednesday, so just monitor that. Stone Smart becomes interesting all the way at the bottom if he were to miss, because it doesn't sound like Hayden Hurst is going to play either. Mark Andrews, 4K.
Yeah.
40 yards or more in 3 straight games. Caught 2 touchdowns last week, caught a touchdown the week before that. I think if Baltimore wants to win the Super Bowl, which is clearly their aspiration, they need to continue to get Mark Andrews right. And 4K, I mean, if he puts up another performance like he did last week, yeah, 4 for 41 with 2 touchdowns. Okay, great. All right, that's 20 points. This will be the last time that he's at 4K. So I think if you wanted to go down there, like Kate Otten, certainly fine at 3,500. I think he's more than an acceptable play. If you did want to take a chance on Andrews, maybe more as a GPP play because people are still not wanting to play him, but I think the signs are that he's starting to potentially emerge.
It's really fun how much the position has flipped, because back when we were sitting there week 2, week 3, like you would have, Kate Otten at 35K would have been 100% owned in the way that tight end landscape was looking. But now, I mean, Kyle Pitts at 4,400, I think, is in play too. I mean, Andrews, I think, is a great call out there. You've got, I mean, Sam Laporta with Jameson Williams out of lineup. Maybe that's what at 4,800, what he needs to get going. Evan Ingram, we've seen him come in with some high target weeks, and yeah, the position just feels like it's done a complete 180 over the last.
Well, it's all come back down because Travis Kelce hasn't performed the way that Travis Kelce normally has. Sam Laporta hasn't performed the way that he normally has. So we've like reestablished that baseline of like, hey, if you can just get me 8 or 9 points, like cool, because that's what the top end guys are getting me anyway.
Yeah, let's move into. We're going to move into our GPP plays. We're going to open the board wide up. But first, before we do that, make sure to head to footballguys.com/plans to become a Hall of Fame subscriber. Hall of Fame subscribers get the access to all DFS content for less than $20 monthly or $95 annually, or check out the GOAT tier. And you can do the GOAT tier and you can get some custom privatized advice for whatever areas of fantasy that you're interested in. Obviously, DFS is our major interest here, and I know Devin has been working hard with the GOAT tier to really kind of return that value, because we appreciate you out there, especially those that join that tier. Let's open it up. Let's do GPP quarterback plays. And Phil, what are you looking at for GPP quarterback plays?
Yep. So the one and only game that I gave you when we opened the show was Green Bay and Jacksonville, and I like both of the quarterbacks in that game. Highest over under on the slate, like we said. I envision this game going a lot like Green Bay's 34-13 home win against Arizona a couple weeks ago. I think it was week 6. Except I think that Trevor Lawrence could do a better job of mounting a comeback attempt than Kyler Murray did. Um, Jordan Love went for 258 yards and 4 touchdowns in that one. His pass volume and the pace of play in Green Bay is always a little bit of a worry, but Love just slings it all over the place, and he's demonstrated that he could reach a ceiling with efficiency, and he doesn't necessarily need a lot of attempts. But speaking of attempts, I think that Trevor Lawrence is probably going to set his season high for pass attempts this week. He's looked better throwing it downfield recently, and I could see that either leading to a shootout where it's going back and forth, or a good amount of garbage time production, which is probably more likely as they're playing catch up later in the game. Lawrence is obviously 5,600, so you get to have a little bit more fun with the rest of your lineup. And we'll talk about stacking partners with Love in a little bit. The only other name I've got written down here is Jared Goff at 6,600. He's playing at an MVP level over the last 3 weeks. He like almost literally can't miss. I think the game environment here and the matchup against Tennessee is going to lead some people to maybe sleep on Goff this week because they don't think that the Titans could push him and fight back. But sometimes that's not how it goes with big home favorites. You know, sometimes they do pace the opposing team, but they roll up all those points by throwing for a lot of yards and touchdowns. And I think that's definitely in play with Goff, with the Lions favored by 11.5. And we mentioned earlier, as a little bit of a bonus, if you're going to double stack him, you could do it relatively cheaply because, you know, you could pay for him and Amon-Ra St. Brown, or you could pay for him and Sam Laporta, who's not that expensive either. And then you could throw in a Tim Patrick or a Khalif Raymond, you know, and I don't even know if you need to run it back with anything on the Titans end at that point. That's all I got.
Devin, you got other plays here?
Let's have some fun. Anthony Richardson, 5,800. It's going to be 1% rostered. Ran the ball 14 times for 56 yards. People are not going to want to play him because he's faced Miami and Pittsburgh the last 2 games that he's played. 2 very strong defenses, especially Pittsburgh's pass rush, Miami's secondary, both very good. Houston, the defense is okay. Certainly not to the caliber that Miami or Pittsburgh is. They've allowed 3 passing touchdowns in each of their last 2 games, and allowed 54 yards rushing or 40 yards. Let's do this: 40 yards or more to Josh Allen, Caleb Williams, and Anthony Richardson. So, you know, Anthony Richardson had 27 points the first time that they played. If he's fully healthy, I think that that's just solid play. Jameis Winston, I talked a little bit about. I think that the Browns are just going to come out and throw the ball because Ken Dorsey is now the offensive play caller. And wouldn't it be funny if they put up more than 20 points or threw for over 300 yards, which is something Kevin Stefanski can't seem to do. And I think there's a bunch of stacking partners there between Cedric Tillman or Jerry Jeudy or even David Njoku that could make that game interesting. I do really like the Jordan Love call. He's my top quarterback for GPPs this week, so completely sign off on that. And then the last name that I'll throw out there, I'll go with Jalen Hurts. I think that he has the stacking partners that you're going to look for. A.J. Brown has certainly showed the upside over the last couple of weeks. And it's a Cincinnati defense that has been actually improving against the run, but they're still having issues against the pass. So Geno Stone looked like he's going to miss this week after suffering a late injury last week. So it's a big loss.
Josh Allen, 7,800. He was the only player in the league last week to throw for 300 yards, 320 against the Titans there. And the addition of Amari Cooper, I think, makes that wide receiver core fall a little bit more in line from where it should be. I think there's a narrative and maybe even analysis that the Bills have the lowest like average plays per game in the entire league, but that's really held down by that Miami game that Tua was injured and they only ran 45 plays in that game, and that's like almost historically low level. And once you remove that, their pace is about league average. So you're looking at a Seattle offense that could potentially push Josh Allen, that we've seen that Seattle defense get exploited in the past. And that's one that access to a high upside that might be a little bit underlooked. But I like the other call outs. That pretty much clears out my list, and we can move into running backs. And I know we mentioned during the cash portion that there's not a lot of value at running back, but are you trying to find ways to play these high-end guys in different lineups?
Yeah. Derrick Henry, 1% rostered, is my favorite guy of the week. I don't know why projection models continue to have him as low as they do. Like, I'm looking around the different industry, and one site has him as low as 13 points on DraftKings, and I think
is it just like not having the passing game aspect, and then also feeling your model might be broken when you put in 125 yards and 2 touchdowns for a guy?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's certainly limits on what the models have, right? And it's, most of them probably don't have over 1 touchdown as a projection. Football Guys has a reasonable projection. I think 19 is our consensus, ranging from 18.2 up to 21.4. I mean, look, at 1% rostered against Cleveland, I'm trying to target running backs who are facing defenses that are on quit watch. And just like defenses that it's the first thing to go, right? It's your gap integrity. It's your linebackers making plays and hitting the right holes. Your corners are out on their island doing their own thing. Like, it's less likely, but to actually stop the run, it takes a collective effort. And if you have a couple of guys that are just kind of dogging it, it's week 8. Everybody's a little tired. You're 1-6. How motivated are you after your quarterback just went down and your fans booed you off the field? Like, I think that there's a lot there that Baltimore could just come out and just run all over this team. Similar vein, I think, New Orleans is also on a quit watch. And J.K. Dobbins at 6,900 is another solid play. Over the last couple of weeks, New Orleans, if I just look at their stats against running backs, Javonte Williams had a huge game. He had 26 DraftKings points. Sean Tucker had 37. Bucky Irvin had 18. Kareem Hunt had 21. So, like, they're really struggling to stop the run. And Dobbins could be a guy who we know has big play potential each and every time he touches the ball. So 6,900 is a price that's probably a little high, but that's going to bring down his roster percentage. Right now he's tracking to be about 10%, but that these numbers certainly can change pretty drastically on from Wednesday to Sunday. But Phil, I'll let you name some names, and then I'll come back if I need to.
Yep, totally agree on Derrick Henry. I think he's another perfect example, and probably even a better example than Kareem Hunt, of the paradigm shift on DraftKings, where the pass catching from running backs is less important than it's ever been. You're just looking at a raw score, and you want it to be as high as you can. And he's the guy scoring the most points one way or another every week. He did catch a touchdown last week, by the way, which was the last leg of a nice four-game parlay that I hit. So thank you, Derrick Henry. Moving on, I've got a bunch of names here. Josh Jacobs is one that Jeff already called out, and I think he did a great job of explaining that. But all of these guys are cash viable, but I think their roster percentages are going to be low enough that they're going to make for better GPP plays. One is Javonte Williams at 6,000, who we also mentioned. But for tournaments specifically, if this Bo Nix thing is actually happening and he's going to be a popular play, then the obvious leverage spot is Javonte Williams. Carolina is softer against the run than they are against the pass. Williams looked superb last week against New Orleans, another soft defense. He's got 15 targets over his last 3 games. Denver's a huge home favorite. What's not to like about Javonte Williams? Joe Mixon at 7,700. I mean, all this guy has done in every game that he's finished is score 30 DraftKings points this season for the Texans. He gets Indy, who gets beat on the ground most weeks, including back in week 1 when Mixon himself went 30 carries, 159 yards, and a score, plus 3 for 19 receiving against them. That's one of those things where he's a little bit too expensive for my taste, but I mean, he's doing it week in and week out. At some point, we might need to accept the new reality here.
He's broken my brain.
Right. Yeah. He went from being one of the least efficient running backs to one of the most, like,
5.2 yards per carry compared to, like, he was always the guy that was like 3.8 to 3.9 every single year. And now he's just like, I'm going to be one of the best running backs in the league. It makes no sense.
For sure. And then another guy I got here is James Conner at 6,500. He's been so solid this year and truly the focal point of that offense. And one of these days, that's going to result in a game with multiple touchdowns. It has eluded him so far. But when it does, and he puts those touchdowns on the board, and Miami is a really great matchup, when it does, it's going to look really nice next to his rushing and receiving numbers. So, again, I wouldn't argue against any of those guys in cash, but I think because of the popularity of some of the cash game plays that we mentioned, and the fact that cash games are going to be a little bit more variable than they've been usually, I think these guys are all strong for tournaments.
Bijan Robinson, 7,200. It seems like the Tyler Algier experiment, whatever it was, a little bit limited. I think that when you look back in hindsight, Bijan Robinson had a shoulder injury that he was going through, and then I think he was listed the next week on the injury report, the hamstring, and then last week he wasn't on the injury report, and he dominated carries just like we saw week 1. So I think that might be a case where you've got a lot of leverage going on that Atlanta passing game after what we saw with, and what we've already talked about with that Tampa Bay matchup, that Bijan Robinson could step in at 7,200 as a natural pivot and fade on kind of those plays there. I think that's interesting. Kenneth Walker, the Bills have given up the second most points to the running back position. And then, if you want to play Josh Allen, maybe you want to play Kenneth Walker. And I think the Bills would be favored and the Bills would be the team that should win. But at the same time, there's some correlation things at play there, especially if DK Metcalf is out, given the pass game leverage that we've seen from Kenneth Walker. Then I think Rachaad White, too, when you talk about those Tampa Bay receiving options being out, when we look down for a kind of a cheap running back play at 5,700, we saw that what he did Monday night, he looked like the best he's looked in his entire career. We talk about Cade Otton as the pivot there for weapons. Utilizing especially Rachaad White out of the backfield might be another natural pivot given their lack of wide receiver options. But Devin, are there any other ones that you want to mention?
No, you covered it.
Let's hit some wide receivers, Devin. How are you going to look at wide receiver?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly a lot of the cash guys that we talked about are certainly in play here, right? I think Cedric Tillman, again, is probably my favorite low end guy here, having the upside. The Browns need to figure out who they have and who they don't, and it's why I liked Elijah Moore last week, who had over 10 DraftKings points. Tillman's in his second year. I think he's certainly going to be a guy that the Browns are going to want to try and build around. But this is the area for me where I'm taking some of these mid-range guys. I think Jalen Waddle is certainly in play at 5,400, depending on how popular he's going to be. So right now he's trending to be about 15% rostered, which is a little bit high, a little bit higher than I'd like it to be, but certainly going to be a player that I'm going to at least be interested in. The Seattle side of things, if DK Metcalf is out, looking at either Lockett or Jackson Smith and Jigba certainly is a play that you could go with. One name that I'm curious as far as Phil, who he has from a stacking perspective, but Romeo Doubs seems to be under rostered this week. Right now he's trending to be about 1.5% rostered. Big game last week. I think he had 11 targets. So, coming back from that suspension, he had 8 for 94 against Houston. Certainly a player who has upside, can catch a deep pass, and at 1% rostered, I think if he stays that way, is probably a solid pivot off of some of the other Green Bay receivers. And then the last guy I'll throw out there, AJ Brown. He just continues to produce. I mean, he's kind of like Derrick Henry at the wide receiver position. All he does is catch touchdowns and go for 90 plus yards almost every week. So I think people don't like to play him for some reason. I know the price is 8,200, and they don't think of him as one of those top end, high end receivers. So he does go a little bit under rostered, but right now he's trending to be 6% rostered, which is more than fair.
Phil, do you have other targets?
Yeah. On the topic of AJ Brown, one idea that I had as I was putting some lineups together, just from a game theory perspective, is I like the idea, and it's possible this week because of the value that's out there. I like putting him and Jamar Chase on the same lineup. So Brown is 8,200, Jamar Chase is 8,500, and the reason that I think that's a good idea is that you're pretty much riding with the fact that that game is going to go way over the total, right? So there's going to be a shootout. Both of these guys are capable of ceilings of 35 plus DraftKings points. And if they both get there, even the people who stack that game will likely only have one or the other because of the price, and very few are going to have both. So I think that's a great way to get your lineup unique. And if they go for 70 plus points, which is very possible, they'll more than pay off that salary, and they'll separate your lineup big time in tournaments. So just something I'm thinking about, a little push pull between those two. 5,400 Jalen Waddle we talked about. I mean, it's kind of the same idea as Tyreek Hill, right? He's just underpriced by at least 1,000, and he's 1,600 cheaper than Hill, and he's maybe not got Hill's consistent ceiling, but he could get there some weeks too. One guy that's cost me a lot of money this year is Calvin Ridley at 5,200. That's another spot where we've got some shakeup on the roster that we haven't talked about, is in Tennessee. But that's because even though DeAndre Hopkins is gone, they don't pass enough or pass well enough for it to really matter. But Calvin Ridley, he's kind of the prayer yard king, right? He's got all these targets, all these air yards. He's running these deep clear out routes, and those quarterbacks just can't hit him. He's been kind of vocal about how upset he is about it. So maybe between that and the move to Mason Rudolph and the departure of DeAndre Hopkins, it kind of forces Tennessee's hands into maybe changing up what they're doing schematically, and maybe they'll try to force the ball more to Calvin Ridley in spots where he could do some things after the catch. It's thin. And he also missed practice today with a foot injury, so watch that. I think if that should happen, if Ridley is out also and Hopkins is out of town, I think we got to look at Tyler Boyd pretty seriously at 3,900. Somebody's got to catch passes over there, either Boyd or maybe Chig or somebody. But I don't know. I was just thinking about the Tennessee passing game a little bit, since I'm sure nobody else is, and there were some personnel changes there this week.
Westbrook Akine has touchdowns in back-to-back weeks, and he's a $3,000 player. So, I mean, if you really wanted to punt the Tampa or the Tennessee game there, real quick, I think Dontavian Wicks at 5,300, I think, is in play. Like, you just look at these wide receiver options for Green Bay are in play. 4,700 to Mario Douglas. Last week was a little bit strange, the Jacksonville game. Apparently he was sick for a couple days leading up to it. Played, he got targeted a couple times very early, and then was out of the game for most of it, and then had one more target coming back in the fourth. And then Troy Franklin at 4,100. We know the college connection with Bo Nix. If you wanted to really play that Denver side against Carolina, he's had a touchdown 2 weeks ago. He led Denver in receiving last week, 5 catches, 51 yards. Just that 4,100, that's under the radar play maybe a little bit. That might be emerging. But tight ends, quickly, is there anything that we've not hit on tight ends that you guys are looking at?
No, I mean, this is a spot where you could pay up, and you could look at Kyle Pitts. You could look at Trey McBride. You could even look at Travis Kelce. But I don't know. I'm still I like some of the pay down options. Mark Andrews again is probably one of my favorite guys this week.
I've got one guy that I absolutely love, and that is my Jordan Love stacking partner, Mr. Tucker Kraft at 4,600. The game environment is great, and tight ends are just eviscerating the Jaguars. Over the last 5 weeks, they've allowed 81% more fantasy points than league average to the position. Big time ceiling games for Hunter Henry and Cole Kmet. I could see a multi-touchdown game in Tucker Kraft's future. So he's the pass catcher that I like best to pair with Jordan Love in stacks. And the other one that I've really got an eye on, it's going to depend on whether or not Dawson Knox plays this week. But Knox missed practice. Dalton Kincaid is 4,900. That's another game that's fairly high scoring that we haven't talked about a ton, but it's got a 47-point total and projected to be pretty close. Seattle's generally been pretty bad at defending tight ends whenever the opponent actually features one in the offense. So they're another team that led up a big game to Hunter Henry over 100 yards. 4 catches for 53 yards was sadly one of Sam Laporta's best games this season. Theo Johnson had career best 5 for 48. George Kittle had 2 touchdowns against the Seahawks, and Kyle Pitts went for 7 catches and 65 yards on 9 targets last week. So, it's more so when they play a good tight end who's featured in the passing game, but I think Kincaid will be if Dawson Knox is off the field, and I think he's a pretty darn good tight end as well. So that
best value play of the slate is Kincaid on FanDuel at minimum price.
He's min price over there, huh?
It's a complete pricing error. Like he shouldn't be, but is.
Wow.
Interesting. If you want to punt, Lucas Krull at 2,700 for Denver. He had 3 catches, 41 yards. He's they basically benched Greg Dulcich, said that's not going to happen. Their other tight ends are Adam Troutman, who we've seen that's not going to happen. He's a very good blocker, and that's it. And then they've got an H-back that Nate Atkins has been getting some snaps, but Kroll is he's our Cecil Lammy mentioned Kroll in the spring as kind of being the potential all-around guy, and he started to tick up a little bit, and that's 2,700. That's about as low as you can go at tight end. But let's do our favorite stacks of the week. And Phil, what is your favorite stack of the week?
Jordan Love, Josh Jacobs, Tucker Kraft, and then you could run it back with a Jaguars receiver. I guess slight lean on Brian Thomas, but I think Christian Kirk will barely be owned, and I could picture him being involved as the Jaguars try to come back. And you could also flip that around, play Lawrence instead with Jacobs and Kraft, and then pick a receiver, or maybe even do a 2 tight end lineup with Kraft and Engram. There's a whole lot of ways that you could go in that game, but I'm going to be building around that as a centerpiece. I'm going to try to get some back and forth in that game into most of my lineups.
Devin, what do you got?
I'm going chalk. Tua, Tyreek Hill, Devin Achan, and James Conner to be a little bit unique. Thinking there is Arizona's going to try and run the ball and keep it out of Miami's offense, Miami's hands, and the way to beat Miami is on the ground. So
let's get weird. Let's go James Winston at 5,200. Let's go Cedric Tillman at 3,300.
Going to do
Let's go Derrick Henry at 8,100. Let's go Rashad Bateman at 4,300, and let's go Mark Andrews at 4,000. And
that's a lot.
Just load into the Browns and Ravens, just getting wild and getting crazy, and kind of, maybe pivot off of the potential rushing from Lamar Jackson and pivot off of Zay Flowers and just get a couple of those receiving options, and Derrick Henry kind of eating, and Jameis Winston's throwing the ball all over as defense that's been exploited, turning the ball over and putting them in position. So let's just get crazy.
I was gonna say Jameis, Cedric Tillman, Derrick Henry, and the Ravens defense, and just hope for like
do that too.
Four picks. So, yeah, I mean, I don't hate the Jameis call.
While on the topic, real quick, you mentioned Zay Flowers missed practice today. We saw him sprain his ankle and get back in the game, but that is one to watch because Bateman at 4,300, I think you'd have to consider him in cash if Flowers misses. He would definitely move up the ranks and become a good all around play.
Well, that leads into our last topic. That's going to be our value play of the week. And Bateman was going to be my value play of the week, and I'll just make it my value play of the week at 4,300. Now, he was wide receiver 2 on the week last week. You talk about Zay Flowers. He made it back into the game, but he didn't do anything when he came back in. I know I had some parlays that needed him to do some things that he didn't do anything, but we did see Bateman go off for wide receiver 2 on the week, and he's sitting at wide receiver 22 on the season. We've had some great production out of there at 4,300. I just think he's arguably, outside of maybe Mark Andrews, the most accessible piece of that Ravens offense. And right now, the way that offense is running, I want pieces of that Ravens offense. But Phil, what's your discount play of the week?
Yeah, I'll take the stand on Trey Palmer being the Tampa Bay wide receiver that you should want most in your lineups this week.
Palmer's min price on FanDuel too, so both him and Kincaid are. I mean, FanDuel just completely went back to like 2018 pricing.
I think he's the bet. I think he's the best bet for a. I think he's the best bet for a touchdown. By the way, Palmer is, and that's why I'm leaning in that direction.
Well, we'll see if he wakes up mad or not. That's going to be the real test. But is Kincaid that just an error by their system? Or
it has to be, and Palmer has to be an error too. Like, there's no reason for those guys, and we see FanDuel do dumb things every now and then. The pricing has been better than DraftKings this year, except this week, which almost makes their slates I don't want to say unplayable, but difficult. Good way to approach that is just fade both of those guys and hope they get like 2 points, because then you can still they're gonna be pretty popular. Cedric Tillman, I think for me is the guy. I do like Jerry Jeudy, so I don't want to just completely like throw him out of the under the bus. But like Elijah Moore, I worry in this offense with Jameis. Kevin Stefanski talked about that Jameis did not have any practice with the starting unit all season. So how they practice, they have the ones practice the entire time. They don't bring the backup quarterback in with the ones. So Tillman has been on the 2s the entire time, should have that chemistry. And we saw a big game from him last week. So
that's not what we got for this week. But Devin, do you have any parting words for our great audience?
No, it's week 8. I'm tired. Good luck, everybody.